Hi everyone, welcome to the governance module of the Azure Masterclass V3. In the last module, we talked about identity as one of the first things you ever need to do when we think about adopting the cloud. Well, now we're going to build on that continuous getting ready to leverage the cloud by looking at governance. And we're going to explore firstly the importance of having guardrails because of changes in the process of how the application owners will actually go and create resources. Understanding some of the core constructs, so specifically management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups, which are where we can apply the various types of guardrails available. Specifically, we'll look at policy, role-based access control, and budgets. And then we'll look at some more general kind of best practices and standards and architectural guidance. So that's the goal of this module. So governance 101. The key point here is governance in the cloud is absolutely critical because when we think about using the cloud, the behavior is very, very different compared to what we have on premises. And what do I really mean by that? So I could think about for a second, if we have our application user. So this is just an app owner. Now imagine I'm on premises. So on premises, we have a certain amount of resource available. We have some back-end servers. And for most organizations, if I want to be able to go ahead and create some resource, what actually happens is there is some operations team. And what happens is I'm going to send a request. So I outline what I want. Hey, I need a VM, I need a container, I need this specification, this operating system. And maybe that's via some nice kind of form. Maybe that's via an email I send. Hey, maybe it's old school and I go and pick up the phone. I might knock on their door saying, hey, go and create this stuff. But whatever that is, there are a set of organizational guidelines and requirements we have to adhere to. And it's the operations person's responsibility to look at the request, and they will consult whatever those rules are that the organization has, maybe modify the request, drive the type of resource they create, and then they go and provision that specific resource. So the point at which the requirements of my organization is enforced is that operations person stands between the app owner and the ultimate provisioning of the resource to make sure things are done the right way. So now if we think about the scenario of the cloud, so now I have Azure. But this really applies to any cloud. Well, now the app owner has direct access. They just go and provision their resources directly against that cloud. There is no operations person standing in between that. Now, I can do this provisioning. Maybe I'm just using the direct portal. Maybe I'm using some CLI. Maybe I'm using infrastructure as code. I'm using some kind of pipeline. I'm as part of DevOps. Whatever the method, they are now creating that directly. There is no human in between this particular part of the chain. And if I think about that, that's not a good thing because every app owner is not going to know all of the particular requirements that they have to adhere to. Maybe it's company policies, maybe it's regulatory by some industry or country. I still need those enforced. So I need the ability to have governance to control, make sure they are operating within the standards we have. So when we still have these sets of rules, and what I require is the ability to these rules just be enforced. So this is where we think about the idea of governance, and specifically that governance needs to protect, no matter how we go, and actually interact with that cloud. So that's really the key point about this. So that could be the amount of stuff they create, what types of stuff they create, what configurations they have on those things they actually do. So in the cloud, by default, there are huge numbers of different types of services available. And a lot of them could actually be very negative. Think about creating public-facing resources where people don't know what they're doing, and they might go and expose things that really shouldn't be exposed. Maybe it helps data get leaked, or it's now a big target that someone tries to attack. And so governance is about enforcing the rules and ensuring that I have all of the standards that I need to adhere to actually being enforced, no matter how that app owner goes and creates those resources. So this is why we need governance. Now, the first step is we actually have to understand our requirements. Before we design any kind of solution, we have to understand what we're actually trying to meet. Now, very often as an organization, you're going to have standards. They could be just based on internal policies we have. They may be driven by outside standards. So they could be about regulatory compliance. That regulatory could be country, it could be industry. Now for Azure, as we talked about in our original foundational module, there's a lot of shared responsibilities. Some things the provider, i.e. Microsoft, are responsible for. Some things you as the customer are responsible for. Now, often, the more we kind of push from the infrastructure as a service to the platform as a service to the software as a service, you're responsible as a customer for less and less, but you still have some responsibilities. Now, Microsoft hold a massive number of compliance certifications, and they have a lot of detail about those compliance standards. If we jump over for a second. So this is the Trust Center of Microsoft. And straight away from here, this divides into a number of different areas that we can go and look at. But I can go and see a detailed list. So if I actually scroll up to here at the top, so if I go to compliance in the Trust portal, well, from here, I can go and look at, for example, compliance offerings. And from compliance offerings, I could then go and look particularly at the Microsoft compliance offerings. And we can start to see, well, all of the different standards that apply to the various services. And this breaks it down. Also, I can go and look based on particular countries. I can look at particular types of service available. So I could go and look particularly at the Microsoft Azure ones, the Dynamics ones. There's a huge amount of information here to really help you understand, well, what is it I'm trying to research? What do I need to know? Additionally, on the main compliance page, I can actually scroll down and I can see, for example, accessibility reports. I can see regional compliance reports. Again, I can see those Azure type solutions. I can see audit reports. So if I wanted to go and get the particular reports for the various compliance Microsoft has, I can jump over and actually get that full list of all of the different compliance attestations they have from those various inspections, and I can actually get all of those results. So here we can see the Service Trust portal, and I can go and look at details around any of these particular things that I want to get that level of detail on. So definitely you can go and spend some time to understand these various capabilities and the various things that I might actually need to understand as part of my use of the cloud. Now, to help you in this endeavor, what we also have available to us is the Purview portal. Now, that can help track our compliance status. So here I'm in the Compliance Manager. Again, this is now part of Microsoft Purview. You need an Office or Microsoft 365 license, or particularly using US Gov or DoD Cloud. There are some special assessments that get you some additional types of regulatory things I can compare against. But here you can see I'm in the portal. It's showing me my compliance score. It's giving me key improvement actions. And if I jump over, I can actually see my assessments. And from here, you could go and add new assessments. But here I'm on my data protection baseline. And what I can do within this particular baseline, it's showing me the progress. And notice there are my points, the things me as the customer are responsible for, and things Microsoft are responsible based on that shared responsibility. And Microsoft are doing way, way better than I am, which is not completely surprising. But from this, I can go and look at all of the various controls that are being assessed. They're broken down into different areas. I can see the detail of the Microsoft actions, what they're doing and where they've passed and their scores. And then I have mine. And when I go and look at my improvement actions, I can see where I've got my various points achieved. I can select these. And then for each one of those, I can track how I'm doing against this. Now you'll notice there's things like I can assign an owner. So I can track on my side, well, who is doing this? Who is responsible for it? I can also edit the details. And when I edit the details, I can go and from the implementation perspective, say, hey, am I doing it? Am I doing something else? Is it out of scope? I can give details on, yes, it's been tested. Once I actually, let's say, implemented, I could then say, oh, it's passed, how it passed, when it was done. I can add notes. So this is a really nice place to go and track all of the various things that I'm doing as part of my compliance. So as an organization, when you have these requirements, and you probably are going to about compliance and everything else, that Purview site is fantastic for being a mechanism for you to go and track and see exactly how you're doing. Now, the key point about all of these governance things really primarily is they're all about mitigating some element of risk. Risk of data loss, risk of infiltration, risk of service interruption, risk of reputation damage, risk of being fired if you do a bad job of implementing these things. But they're all about mitigating the risk. Now, there are key organizational components that play a huge factor as part of our overall governance approach. Now, the first one is management groups. Now, management groups help us form a hierarchy under which we eventually put our Azure subscriptions, which is really the building block of where we can create everything. Now, if I look at our picture here, so I drew the idea of just Azure. Okay, that's just Azure. That's specifically, we could say, the cloud. But our building block often, remember, is a certain subscription. We get subscriptions. So I could imagine, okay, I've got a certain subscription. Now, if we remember, when we talked about identity, every Azure subscription trusts a specific Entra tenant. So I'm going to have my Entra tenants. That's the directory that, remember, houses all of the various security principles that are used within that subscription. So I have my organization's specific Entra tenant. And the subscriptions in my organization trust that tenant to be its directory. Now, under your organization's Entra tenant, the first key building block we have are the management groups. And every Entra tenant has a root management group. So every tenant has one and only one root management group. Now, under that root management group, which I cannot move, I cannot put it anywhere else, I create a hierarchy. So I can now create really whatever sets of management groups I want as part of how I want to organize my various subscriptions and the types of governance I want to apply. So all of this are management groups. This additional hierarchy I can create, this can actually be up to 6 levels. Now, I wouldn't make it complicated just for the sake of complicated, but I have a lot of flexibility to make it do what I need it to do. Now, this is one of the places where the Entra permissions do have a say on the Azure sets of permissions you have. Because if I am a global administrator, so here, for example, I'm looking at Entra, and I am a global administrator. Now, if I look at my overview, and I look at my properties within the overview, you'll notice there is access management for Azure resources. And I've got it set to yes. Now, this is not something you would typically have set to yes, but I've got it yes to show you this. And so now it says my current account can manage all Azure subscriptions and management groups in the tenant. What that's doing is actually giving me a special permission. So if I just looked at anything, I can just go ahead and look at the access control of a subscription that trusts my tenant, and I look at role assignments, one of the things you'll actually see is we have this concept of this user access administrator. And we can see that my account has this inherited from the root management group. So this is a special permission that's been given to me because I specifically have done that elevation. Now, once again, this is not something you should typically be having. This isn't something you should be doing normally, but it is a nice break glass capability that if you had some subscription owner and they left the company and everyone is locked out, a global admin for your Entra tenant could go and elevate themselves up and give themselves that permission temporarily to go and resolve that particular problem. Now, although I cannot rename the ID of the root management group, I can change its display name. And as part of your tenant, all subscriptions have to trust that particular Entra tenant to be able to be part of that hierarchy. Now, I can have up to, 10,000 management groups per tenant. A management group can only have one parent. So it has to report into one way in this direction, but a particular parent can have many children. And it's really designed to help make your governance easier at scale. I could think about when I start wanting policies or certain permissions, the most core things that have to apply everywhere, well, I could apply those very broad policies at the root or very high up. As we get into more specifics that are more tailored to a particular maybe environment or geo or whatever, well, I would apply those policies lower down. And it's very common for these management groups, I might organize them by things like geo, because again, I'm really using these constructs for governance purposes. So if I have different policies based on geo, it would make sense to have a geo management group at a certain level. I might have it based on the business unit because they might have different requirements, or I have different sets of permissions I want rolled up. I might have some based on environment. Hey, I have different policies for dev, test compared to production. And so that might be useful to a certain point. You split them off that way. And only the subscription owners can change the subscription's place in the management group. So you can absolutely move subscriptions around, but only the subscription owner can do that. So if I quickly jump over for a second. So if I go and look and I search for management groups, I can see, well, I have the tenant root. And then I have a particular subscription directly under the tenant root. And by default, if I do nothing else, a subscription that trusts my tenant will automatically roll up to the tenant root. And then I can move it. But then I also have a child management group called All Savile Tech Subscriptions. And then I also then have, which I have 2 subscriptions roll up under. Then I also have a child development management group and a production management group. So you can go ahead and create these and you can move them around really however you want. You just have to be that subscription owner to be able to do that particular movement. Then we have subscriptions. Now, a subscription is the starting unit for creating anything in Azure. They're the basic unit for billing, for management. They have certain security elements to them as well. And remember, my subscription trusts a specific Entra tenant, which will then go and place it under that root management, and then I can go and move it. I mentioned previously, I think it was in the first module, yes, you can change the Entra tenant a subscription trust for the identity, but it would lose all of the role-based access control. It actually will get removed. I'll lose my managed identities. It wouldn't change the billing status. So it's just a really hard thing to do. So generally, you're never going to do that. If you have resources in your Azure subscription, you are never going to want to just go and move it to another tenant. Security and permissions are a key construct to the resources. So if suddenly you just strip all of those away, it's generally going to be a really, really bad thing. So that's not something you're typically going to want to do. Now, I can control as the Entra administrator if I want to allow subscriptions to be joined, I trust my tenant, or if they trust my tenant to be able to leave my tenant. So I have that control. So if we jump over again, so now I'm in the Azure portal, and now if we go and look at subscriptions, so when I look at subscriptions, you'll see this advanced options menu. And there's one here called Manage Policies. If I look at Manage Policies, this is where I can do controls around, well, can they leave the Entra tenant? Now I've got allow everyone, but I could say permit no one. Who can add a subscription to my tenant? Well, I've got everyone, but you could permit no one. And as soon as I start doing those kind of permit no ones, etc., you could then just have exempted users. So no one could add or no one could remove except these particular people that you want to be able to do those things. So you have a lot of controls over exactly how you want to do that. And the key point now then would be, I will now have these subscriptions. So at some point, and again, a subscription could be under here, it could be under here, it could be under here, wherever you do that, but I will now have subscriptions. So I'm going to go ahead under this particular management group. I have N number. So it's not just one. I can have many subscriptions all put together under a particular place. So this is my subscription A. And again, you can have subscription B, C, you name them, things that are useful to you that you want good naming standards that we're going to talk about. And now that is its place in the hierarchy. Now, one of the things that we have is there are limits. So if we jump over quickly to our slide, I've got a link on the slide. There are limits in everything in Azure. And so we can actually go and see here and look, well, what are the various limits? And you'll see there's limits for different types of service, but there's management group limits. I talked about the 10,000 already. I talked about you can have the root and then 6 levels of those things, how many root management groups you can have, things like that. There are subscription limits. So it's saying here you can have unlimited number of subscriptions per Entra tenant. We can have 980 resource groups. We're going to talk about that in a second. How many tags I can have on a subscription. How many subscription level deployments. Then there's resource group limits, template limits, Entra ID limits. So if you're ever curious about, well, what can I do with X service or this thing? Go and look at the subscription limit page. It's a really great page to understand exactly what we want to do with this. Now, the other thing that's going to come up when we think about our subscriptions is, well, how many subscriptions should we have? And there used to be guidance that was you really want to keep the number of subscriptions to a very, very small number, and you only really add a subscription when you have to. That guidance has changed to really now the guidance is a lot looser. And we now say, well, you know what? It's not really that big a deal how many subscriptions you have. Create them as it makes sense. It makes sense as, hey, I have a particular workload. This workload, which is the complete unit of things, let that have a subscription. Let the business decide what makes the most sense for how it's going to package those things up. Because what's happened is, yes, a subscription is a boundary for some things, like a virtual network. It cannot span subscriptions. But there are other things like a service health alert that doesn't always give you a lot of specifics about the resource that this alert is about. So if I have 20 different apps sharing a subscription and I get this service health alert, well, it can actually be difficult to know, well, what is it actually relating to? We have certain limits on the subscription. Well, now I'm sharing them among a different set of things. And so with this capability of management groups, it becomes a lot easier to say, look, you can be a bit looser with the subscriptions where I have common requirements for permissions or policy. Well, just make sure your management group structure is logical. Make sure your subscriptions are in the right place in that hierarchy, and they'll still get the right policies. They'll still get the right RBAC. And so that's really kind of the guidance that we think about today for leveraging this. And we already talked about the various limits we have available. And then the other key construct we're going to see here is resource groups. And a resource group is what we actually use to deploy a resource into. Every Azure resource lives in one and only one resource group. So if we go and look at our picture, and a resource group lives in a specific subscription. So now I can think about, well, within this subscription, I can create a bunch of different resource groups. So we'll call this resource 1, but I could also have resource group 2. They are not nested. I cannot put a resource group inside another resource group. It's all flat within my particular subscription. And what I then do is I put things together into a resource group that share a common life cycle. So I could think they're going to get created together, they run together, ultimately they're likely going to get deprovisioned together, the elements of some particular service. So maybe I've got an AKS cluster in here. The AKS cluster also works with a particular, maybe MySQL database or something else. All good, all fantastic. And so I would think about, yes, if I have a common life cycle, let's put them together in a resource group. Because also, all those policy things and the role-based access control things I briefly mentioned, I can apply at the resource group. And most likely, if I have a particular workload, I'm going to have similar people would want similar permissions on those things. I might have similar policies I want to be able to apply. Now, an important point here, though, a resource group is not a boundary of resources being able to work together. So imagine I had a virtual network, for example, over here in a completely different resource group. I can still have those nodes that make up the AKS cluster connected to the VNet in a completely different resource group. So don't think of it as, oh, well, it's a boundary. I have to have them all together. That is not the place at all. And it's very common that maybe my networks would be in a separate resource group because maybe I have the networking team. They want certain permissions on those things. Now, a resource group does have a region specified when you create it, but that's really just where its metadata lives. I can have resources from all different regions in the same resource group. There's no problem with that at all. And I can move resources between resource groups. So if we jump over to the portal for a second, if I just pick a certain resource group, I don't even know what I have in some of these things, but I'm just going to pick one. What we can see over here is we have this move option. And you can see I can move it to another resource group. I can move to another subscription. If I actually started to select some stuff, we also have moved to another region. Now, it's going to do a validation on those things, especially moving to another region. So it will go and look and see, oh, okay, well, is this practical? Can I actually go and do this? So you can move resource groups is generally the easiest thing to do. Other subscription, it depends. Region, that's going to vary by the exact resource. Now, you'll probably have noticed actually here, all these menu item options, I can delete the resource group and everything in it. I cannot rename a resource group. It forms a core part of the identity of the resources that are within it. What I would have to do is create a new resource group and then move the things. So there's quite a lot of work, obviously, involved in that. And the key point of all of this stuff we have now got is these places, these management groups, the subscriptions, the resource groups, are going to be the primary places where I can apply the different types of governance. So think of different scopes that I'll get in closer and closer, i.e. more and more specific to the resources. So really broad type governance I would apply at the root and top level management groups. I could get a lot more specific at the subscription. Then at the resource group, I would be very, very specific, because as I get closer and closer to the actual resource, we get more and more specific. Now, you can apply a lot of the things to the resources as well, and we'll talk more about this, but we generally avoid it just because there are limits on how many things of something I can apply, like how many role-based access control things I can have. But it also just gets way too hard to actually manage. It becomes impractical. And if we've done a good job of actually grouping things together in the resource groups the right way, generally there shouldn't be a requirement where I have to start doing resource level sets of things. Again, it just gets way, way too difficult. So next, naming standards. So before we look at any specific set of capability, there's actually two core areas I want to look at. And the first is the naming. So having a standard is super important. Azure actually has some really good recommendations. And this is part of the cloud adoption framework. This is a set of really good guidelines for pretty much all aspects of the cloud. And it talks about, hey, develop your naming and tagging strategy for your Azure resources. And it talks about why you want to do it, naming and tagging strategy and everything else. And then the next thing we actually have here is your actual naming convention. So it has a recommendation of a good naming standard. Now, in this case, you can see it's broken down into the idea of, well, the resource type, the workload or application, which environment, so that could be dev or non-prod, whatever naming you use, the Azure region, or it could be your on-premises data center, and then the particular instance number. Because I really want to be consistent as much as possible. I would like it to work not just in Azure, but I would like this to be able to go and work in the other environments I might have as well. So I really, really want to be consistent when I think about the naming. So as an organization, if you don't have one already, take some time and actually create a naming convention that you will use and have it consistent for on-premises and the cloud. And also extend it to things like the guest OS itself. So I'll be able to fairly intuitively just look at a resource and say, oh, well, okay, that's in Azure, it's in this region, oh, this is the workload it's part of, this is its particular function and its type, and oh, I can see there's multiple instances of it. It makes it great to just quickly be able to understand what's actually happening in the environment. And as an extension of that, great, there's certain amounts of things that I can do as part of the naming, but there's only so much I can fit inside the name. Tagging gives me this ability to have a name of the tag and then a value for the particular tag. These pairs, which is available for pretty much every single type of resource that exists in Azure. That includes subscriptions, that includes resource groups. It does not include management groups. But basically, for pretty much everything else, I can do this. And it helps me be able to look at a resource, and then I get a bunch more detail about particular aspects of it. So if I just go and think about, well, really any of these different levels here we're talking about, except the management group. So it could be a resource group, it could be the subscription, it could be a particular resource. I can go and apply tags. So I just have this metadata that's made up of this idea of a key and then the value of it. And hey, I want to do a tag at the subscription. Hey, I want to do a tag at the resource group level. Hey, I want to go and do a tag at this particular resource. I can go and do all of those things. And there are some standards about how I should think about which are core tags that you have in your environment. You have a lot of flexibility in that. So have standards, and the Microsoft documentation goes through some good examples. I think I can have up to 50 tags on pretty much all of the types of resources. On the limits page, I think there's a few that can only have 15. The tag name can be 512 characters. Tag value, I think, can be 256 characters. So I can have a lot of things in here. But there are some standards again and recommendations about what is my tagging strategy. And this is a nice thing that talks about some minimum suggested tags. So business criticality, the business unit, the operations team, the app owner, the cost center, the environment, the Azure region, the owner name. There's nothing worse than having Azure resources and maybe as a administrator, you're going and looking at the resources and it's just no owner. And you have no way of knowing who is using this resource. If I have a good tag strategy, there would be a business unit, an app owner, and I could always go back to that and work out who is actually leveraging it. Because I don't want to just go and delete a resource that I think has been abandoned and I take down the company. Again, resume generating event, don't want that to happen. So have a strategy for how I'm actually going to do this. And do have a standard for the values as well. So it's great that I have a standard number of keys, but have a standard for what the values will be. For example, environment. It's no good if some people say prod, some people say production, some people say live, because that's going to make it very hard to actually leverage in a useful way. So yes, have common keys you want in your environment, but also you want to have common values so they're actually useful for you to leverage for the purpose of them. I can enforce their use through policy. So I can require you to put these particular keys, but just be careful. There are times this will break stuff. Imagine I have some kind of automation that goes and creates some resources, and I don't have the ability to interject and get tags added, which is going to block me being able to do it. So that can actually be a pretty painful thing to have. So just be careful with using policy to deny if you don't add the tag. So be careful of that. And they're really powerful. I mean, they're used everywhere. I can filter my views based on tag and this key and having this value. Billing, I can actually filter down and inherit based on those things. The value can even be a document. So imagine I have the concept where there are a limit on the number of tags I can have, and I want additional information. Well, I could have like a JSON document as the value of that key, and then I could have code that goes and inspects that. So don't think you're only limited to the number of tags that are supported. I can have richer content within the tag value that could have malware version or anti-malware version, firewall configurations, etc., etc. Now, one really important thing, these are not inherited. So we're used to the idea of inheritance. And one of the things I'm going to stress as we talk about in a second, if I apply a policy here or a permission here, it gets inherited by the child management groups, which get inherited by the subscriptions. They get inherited by the resource groups. They get inherited by the resources. That does not happen with tags. If I set a tag at the subscription or a tag at the resource group, it is not inherited by the resources. Now, you may say, well, I want that. I want it to inherit those things. You can achieve it. So one of the things that we have is Azure Policy. And policy is super powerful. It's one of the Azure superpowers, especially with governance. If I go and look at my definitions, and what we're going to do is change the category. Instead of all, we'll actually go and look at tag and apply. And we'll see a number of policies here. I'm just going to type the word inherit in the search. And notice what I can do here. I can inherit the tag from the resource group if it's missing. So if I don't remember to add the tag for a particular resource when I create it, it will just go and grab the value from the parent resource group. Or inherit it from the subscription if it's missing. I have that choice. Or I can say, I don't care if it's missing or not, I want you to inherit it from the resource group or subscription. So while the default behavior is it will not inherit from the parent, I can absolutely enable that through Azure Policy. So I have all of that control. Another thing you can do specifically around the billing is for cost management outside of policy, I can inherit the value of a tag from the resource group or subscription just for billing purposes. Now, I'll cover that in more detail when we look at billing, and it doesn't actually copy it to the resource. But if I think from a billing perspective, well, I want to know all of the things that are application XYZ, it will just go and inherit it from the resource group or subscriptions. That's a really powerful cost management capability. So what can we do? We have all these levels of management groups and then subscriptions and resource groups, and they are there primarily for this governance set of capabilities. Through all of those different levels, I can do various things. And what we can do here is apply a number of different aspects. And I've mentioned some of them already, but I do want to stress up front, and I've already talked about it, inheritance is everything about these things. When I apply something, if it's a policy or a permissioning, wherever I apply it, it is inherited down. So if I apply something at the root, every management group, every subscription, every resource group, every resource will inherit that. If I apply it to the subscription, everything within the subscription, and the resource group, everything within the resource group. So the core point here is I want to be careful where I apply these things, because it's not just applying at the scope I pick, it's all of the child scopes as well, which is really powerful when I think about, hey, I want something to apply to the whole organization, or I want something to apply to my whole subscription. All of these constructs we're talking about are going to do exactly that. If it's a budget, then it rolls up to the scope. So if I set a budget at the subscription, well, all of the resources in all of the resource groups would roll up to that particular budget. And we'll talk about some of the specifics of that as we go through each individual area. But it's really important to understand that inheritance is core to everything. So we have role-based access control. Who can do certain actions at the specific scope? We have the idea of policy. So policy is all about, well, what can be done? We have budget. Well, budget is how much of something. Now, budget actually has different dimensions to it. It could be a budget in terms of financial spend, but it also could be there are certain limits in terms of how many of a certain type of resource we can do. And again, I can set tags and other dimensions to use showback, chargeback of all those various things. Another thing we can do is locking. Now, locking, I can do at the subscription, the resource group, or the resource level. So we talked about this idea of firstly, of all these different things that we have, all of these constructs, they're all about the idea of role-based access control, which is about really who can do these various things. We have policy, which is what they can do. And then we have budget, which is really how much. And we're going to go into details on all of those different things. But the other thing I can do is I can apply locks. Now, a key point here is a lock is at the control plane of Azure. And what that means is it doesn't stop data actions against a resource. So if I lock a storage account, then I can potentially not be able to delete that storage account. I can't change attributes of the storage account, but I could still delete data within the storage account. So the really important thing here is they're all applying at the control plane. Now, when I create these locks, it says create a lock, I get a choice. Now, I can set it to be read-only. So if it's a read-only lock, then I can't change the attributes of something or delete it. If I set it to cannot delete, then I can change the attributes of the resource. I just can't delete that resource. And again, this is inherited. Now, I could apply this lock at a subscription level, in which case those things I'm setting would apply to everything in the sub. I could apply it to a particular resource group. I could apply it to a particular resource. But it is control plane only. I cannot delete the storage account. I cannot delete the database, but I absolutely could still delete a row within the database. I can absolutely still delete a blob from the storage account. It's really about helping protect against accidental deletions. I have to be the owner at the scope applied to be able to remove that lock. But just don't forget, it's not locking in terms of immutability of the content of that resource. Remember, I talked about this idea of the governance that surrounds it, and everything always goes through this governance. Well, this is where the locks are applying as well. And we have this Azure Resource Manager, which is the control plane for Azure, so it can enforce all of those things. But when I do a data action, it's not going through the Azure control plane. So it's not locking those types of things. And if we jump over for a second, we can go and see. So if I just go and look at some resource storage account, we'll see we have the concept of locks. And some services will add locks automatically. You can actually see like Azure Backup has added a lock. But I can just go and add a lock. And I pick the type, read-only, or I'm locking the ability to delete it. And of course, if it's read-only, I can't change anything, and I can't delete it either. And it gets inherited down. Notice this lock is at this particular scope, but also it would be possible to create a lock. So I'm going to look at resource group. I could create a lock here as well. I could create a lock at the subscription. We have those capabilities, and it all just gets inherited. So they're a useful thing to protect against really accidental type deletions. So then, just a quick word on this Azure Resource Manager thing that I've mentioned. So we're going to cover this in a lot more detail in the infrastructure as code module later on. But it's really important to understand the structure of resources, particularly because when we talk about things like Azure Policy is all built around the attributes of resources, and it exposes certain things as attributes of them. And I can think the way it's all really structured is we have resource providers that have different types of resource. So when I want to have, okay, so Azure, I see all these different types of things out there. What's actually happening behind the scenes, give myself a bit of space, is Azure is made up of n numbers, many, many different resource providers. And then within that particular resource provider, it opens up a whole bunch of different resources, so different resource types. So like the compute resource provider has virtual machines. It has virtual machine scale sets. It has managed disks, I think, are all things in there. And then these resources, they have different properties. And they also have different actions that can apply to them. And we can see the makeup of these various things. And if we jump over back to the documentation for a second, so if I just look at resources, so this is the Azure Resource Explorer. So this is the way I can actually dive straight in and look at some of the underlying structure. And I can see, oh, there's resources here. And it's going to go ahead and list all the different resources I have. But I could look at the resource providers. Oh, now it's going to take forever because I selected resources. That was a mistake. But now we can see all the different resource providers. And then, as I mentioned, compute. If I open up the compute resource provider, well, then from the compute resource provider, it would have, let's carry on waiting. It would have its particular set of resources within the compute resource provider. And I would be able to go and explore those various things. Another place you can actually see this, if I just go in the portal, and let's say just look at a resource. So in the portal, in its overview page, one of the things you'll see is the ability to actually view its JSON. I think I've slowed down my entire environment running that massive resource query. Because there are limits. There's actually limits on the number of queries you can make in a certain amount of time in Azure. So I'm probably exhausting it right now because of that Resource Explorer query. And it's locking all of my quota to query the control plane. So you'll notice on the portal, I have this JSON view in the corner. If I select this, it shows me the underlying JSON that is providing this resource. And specifically what I care about here is the type. And so I can see it's the Microsoft.storage resource provider, and the particular resource type is storage accounts. So it's just nice to really be able to go and understand that. And this is exactly the same type of resource I need if I'm using a template. So over here, this is a bicep file to create a storage account. And exactly the same, hey, I'm using the Microsoft Storage Resource Provider, and I'm creating a storage account. Then there's a particular API version that I'm going to use when I start to define some of the details around it. But it's consistent through all of the various things we have here. And there's going to be different actions that I can leverage as part of it. For example, if I look at my Azure roles for a second, I could query here. What I'm asking for is, what are all of the actions that can apply to a virtual machine? So if I run this command, it will show me the applicable actions that exist for this resource in this resource provider. So I had the start action, a power off action, a reapply action. And this would be really useful if I wanted to go and, for example, start creating a custom role or want to understand exactly what something can do. Well, I can actually go and inquire and say, well, look, what are you doing in this thing? How can I actually go and leverage it? So understanding this is really important to be able to do maybe more advanced policy things, to go and create the role-based access control and all of these different capabilities. Now, the exact actions you're going to see are going to vary wildly depending on the actual exact resource you're working with, but it's nice to be able to go and look into those. So then we have role-based access control. At all levels, management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resource, they support role-based access control to control the actions the various identities can take at that scope. And remember, anything that is a child of it. So those all get inherited down. Yes, I can apply access control at a per resource level. But as I mentioned before, it's really hard to manage. Generally, I'm going to stick to resource group or above. Some automations will create permissions at the resource level, but it just gets difficult. Also, there are a limit on the number of role assignments per subscription I can have. I think it's 4,000 per subscription. So if I start creating a whole bunch of role-based access controls at a per resource, I'm going to run out. And because you very nicely grouped all your resources logically in resource groups, I should be able to just apply it the resource group at that minimum level. It is inherited, as mentioned. I cannot block inheritance. Some people say, well, I want this. I want to be able to say, hey, I don't want to inherit any permissions that have been set higher up the scope. But you have to really think about what that would mean in reality if you had that ability to block inheritance. Because the whole point is someone has set that permission at the subscription level because they want permission to everything. If I, as a resource group owner, could say, hey, I don't want you to have this permission, that really undermines the whole point of having this. And so there is no concept of blocking the inheritance. There is no even deny permission outside deployment stacks. So there is a certain ability for a certain policy to deny certain types of actions. For example, right now, I could deny the ability to delete something through policy, but there is no role-based access control, just, hey, don't let them have permission, which would override having a permission at a higher level. Now, when we have these things, we do have data plane for some types of resource. It's going to vary. Now, remember, so maybe before we go into that, what is a role? I drew this idea, remember, that we have these actions that vary depending on the type of resource we're actually looking at. And what I do is I'm going to group those into roles. And the reason we do that is technically, could I do a permission at a time? And there were some technologies that do that. But it'll get so complicated. There'd be so many. It would be so hard to manage. And there's very common sets of permissions, actions we need to take on certain types of resources. So we add actions into particular roles. And then we're going to grant that role to groups. Now, yes, we can also grant them to individual identities. But as we talked about before, that gets kind of messy. So what I would much rather do is when I have different types of identity, and this could be a user, a human fleshy thing. It could be a managed identity for an application. It could be a service principal. It doesn't matter. I add those into the group. And then I'm going to grant the role to a group at a particular scope. Once again, that scope could be sub, it could be management group, it could be resource group. We're not going to talk about resource. And all of these things together, when I'm granting the role to the group at the scope, we call this a role assignment. So that's what it's talking about. So we're taking a role, we're granting it to a security principal groups at some specific scope. And if we go and look, there are a huge number of these built-in roles. Now, if I was to look at a storage account, and I look at the access control, identity and access management, and I look at roles, it's only going to show me roles that have something to do with storage in them. And there's obviously a lot of things use storage. But it's going to show me all of the different roles that have something to do with storage within those things. And I could look at any of these roles. Now, owner is obviously super powerful. If I look at the details of owner, we have these actions. And I mean, it's basically going to be everything. It has all of the various permissions across all of the different resource providers because owner is the king. Owner can change the permissions on the resource. It's mine. There's also things like contributor. Contributor can do almost everything the owner can do except change permissions at that scope. So I can't change the permissions, but I can assign attributes to things. I can change properties, but I can't give other people permissions to that particular resource. And remember, we want to be as granular as possible. So we grant people the minimum possible role so they can do their function. Now, if I look at a resource group and look at access management, because a resource group can include pretty much anything, it's going to have every single role that possibly exists. So it's going to have huge numbers of those available. Now, one of the things we saw, though, when I go back to that storage account, is when I look at the role, let's just go back to a more basic one. Let's do storage. If I look at a storage account contributor, we have a whole set of actions. These are control plane actions. And then you see this data actions option. If I select that, this has none. But if we look at this blob data contributor, and you'll see there's a number of these that have the word data in them. So there's also storage queue data and storage table data. If we look at one of these roles, they still have some control plane actions, but they also have data plane actions. So this lets me now, in the past we had to have like access keys. It wasn't integrated directly into the Entra identity model. Well, now some of the services, and more of the services, including a lot of the databases, they also now have the capability to apply permissions using those roles and giving them permissions. So now I don't have to use an access key, which is really not identity specific. It makes it hard to audit. Now I can actually just integrate in as part of my all-up set of capabilities, which is really nice. So as much as possible, use data role-based access control integrated with Entra, because it's better from a granularity perspective. I can just give the permissions I want. But also what's nice is things like managed identities, where we have an automatic identity for a resource, it can still go and interact with data capabilities. If I have multiple roles assigned to me, I get the sum of all of those roles. So if I have this permission and these permissions from this role, and it's all inherited down, I get the sum of all of the different permissions. In fact, if we go back for a second, if I was to just look at the access control, I can see all the different role assignments. And what you'll see is these are all identities that have some permission on this storage account. And you can see why. So you can see, like, I'm an owner, but I'm an owner because I have some permission applied at a parent management group. It was inherited. These all have permissions because they inherited them from the subscription. And you'll see nearly all of these are not actually on this resource. Most of them are actually applied to some other level. There are a few things on this particular resource for demo purposes when we start talking about some of the data permissions. So we can show and play around with all of those capabilities. But it does inherit, and I get the sum of all of those permissions. So if I do check access and I view my access, it's going to show me these are all the permissions I have because it's the sum of all of these different assignments I have on all these different levels. So yeah, I'm a contributor and I'm an owner, so that's owner. And then I have all these different data roles as well across all these different assignments that I have at different levels. So it is not, I only get the permissions of maybe the least or the most. It is the sum of everything that has been applied to me. They're the permissions I am actually getting. Now, those roles consist of actions that I get assigned at that particular scope. Fantastic. I can also create custom roles. Now, we want to be careful of not going nuts and creating too many of these, but think of least privilege. If there is no built-in role that matches the permissions an identity actually requires to do their job, I can absolutely create a custom role. And a custom role is made up of actions, not actions, data actions, and not data actions. and then you specify a specific scope where you want them to be able to be applied. Now, I can have up to 5,000 custom roles per Entra tenant. I think it's 2,000 for the China cloud. So don't go too nuts with creating these. But if there isn't a role that meets what you need, hey, you can absolutely go and create a custom role. So if let's go look at my resource group. If I go to access control, I can add a custom role. And from that custom role, I can start from scratch, or I could clone another role. So I could clone a role. I could select the role I want to clone. So it's similar to what I want, but maybe it does too many things. So maybe I'll just search for data for a second. I don't know. So storage queue data contributor, I'll give it a name. And it shows me all the permissions. But notice I could add some permissions. I could exclude, so I could do some nots, because maybe some of these permissions here have got a wild card, like it does, these don't, but maybe it's wild card, so it includes lots of things. I want to exclude a particular set of permissions. And then I have certain assignable scopes. I cannot do all like you can with the built-in ones. I would have to say I want it to be assignable at this subscription and this resource group. I have to go and specify those things. And the JSON, it would show me exactly what I mentioned, the actions, the not actions, the data actions, and then the not data actions. And then you have the specific scopes where you can go and apply this role. So if you find there isn't anything out the box that's doing what you actually need it to do, and in the sample files for this module, there's some scripts on how you can actually go and do these as well, then hey, absolutely you can go and create a custom role. But what I would recommend is if you think it's a custom role that's going to be actually useful in a large number of maybe subscriptions and resource groups, make the assignable scope at a higher level. Now, it could be a management group. Remember then so don't think of I'm going to create a custom role and it can only be assigned to this resource group. If it could be useful for many resource groups, make those assignable scopes. And I can have a lot of assignable scopes per custom action. So I'm not clogging up that 5,000 maximum number I can actually create by only being able to use something once. So think about managing that. Okay. Grant to groups, not users. We talked about this. Those groups can be assigned where I put the people in. They can be dynamic where I have the attributes it's looking at. And that should also help with the number of role assignments I'm doing. It avoids just having way too many over time. Don't forget, though, leverage PIM. Remember, privileged identity management lets us have just in time, in addition to just enough permissions. It will make the role eligible, and so I activate it for a certain period of time when I actually want to do this. So this idea here of granting, when I do that grant, one of the great things is here, use PIM. So instead of it just being active, it would be eligible. So I would go in, I'd have to follow those rules about why I need it. And one of the really nice things they've done is if we go over to the portal for a second, if I'm looking at a resource group or a subscription, if I do an add role assignment, one of the things you'll now notice is assignment type. And it actually integrates with PIM. And I can now say, hey, I want it to be eligible. And it's actually the recommended instead of just active. And I could make it all permanent or it's just time bound. And I can even then go and see the various PIM policy I want to apply. So it's front and center in the portal now to say, hey, we really want to be using PIM. Let's just do just enough as opposed to just having it sitting there all the time. Of course, if I'm using PIM, remember that is a P2 feature. So there's a cost element to that as well. Another thing I would say, also remember with RBAC is there are the ability to do access reviews. So that could go and track, for example, hey, group memberships to fine tune and tweak who has access to what. But then we get into ABAC. So attribute-based access control. Role-based access control is fantastic, but it can actually get bloated if I need a lot of granular permissions. Because think of those data actions for a second. So those data actions, it's like, hey, I'm actually now getting access to the content of the storage account. Well, imagine I had one storage account, but I had maybe different containers, like folders, for different groups' data. Well, now, how would I manage those permissions? It would get really difficult. I'd have to have a ton of storage accounts and tons of role-based access control. Wouldn't it be nicer if I had the ability to look at some attribute of maybe the identity that is accessing the resource and compare it to attributes of the resource I'm trying to access, and only then allow that communication? So I could have conditions in addition to that role-based access control. And it could be, hey, an attribute on my account has to match a blob index tag on a blob. It might be I have to be connecting via a certain type of environmental factor. I have to be using a private endpoint. I have to come from a certain subnet. Maybe it has to be within this time window. So it's comparing the time against UTC. So I have these really nice capabilities to add that ability. Now, at time of recording, it's limited around only certain built-in or custom roles related to blob or queue data actions, but hey, that may grow over time. So the whole point of what we are now doing is, if I think of this role assignment that I performed with attribute-based access control, and it's optional and it's only remembered for certain things, I'm adding additional conditions as part of that assignment. Let's have a look. So I'm going to go over to, I think it's my number 10 storage account, and I can look at the role assignments, and everything still looks normal. Now, again, we're talking about it's for those blob data sets of permissions, for example. And if I scroll over, you can see this column on the right. And this one has a view edit. If I scroll up, it's condition. And what this particular condition is doing, it's for the blob data reader, i.e. the permission to read blobs. And it's been applied to the Justice League group. So it's not been applied to some individual. And what it's saying, if we go and look at this, is the conditions. Well, there's two conditions here. The first one's easy. The container's name, ignoring the case, has to be general. So if I'm in the Justice League and the container name is general, then I have the blob data permission. But then the other one is based on the user's principal from the Microsoft directory, i.e. Entra. It's looking at, now we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but it's looking at a custom attribute set called project attribute set, and specifically an attribute called primary project, and it has to equal a blob index tag value called project. So that's a scenario I was talking about, that what I'm looking at here is the user has some attribute, and I can only read the data if the data has, in this case, the same value for that particular attribute as well. So that's the key point in this. I'm having to match that project to have that permission. Now, there were other things that we saw there as well. If I go and add an expression, I can do things based on the principal, the request, the resource. Environment would be things like, hey, the subnet, the private endpoint, is it private link, the time. So I could reduce things based on those particular capabilities. So how does that work with the user's capabilities? So if I go to protection in Entra, we have this concept of custom security attributes. And I've created a bunch of these, but I've created one called project attribute set. And then I've got something called primary project. And it's got predefined values of alpha, gamma, bravo. And then you can go to your identities. So if we look at my users, and we'll look at Clark Kent. Clark has custom security attributes I've populated, and specifically, I have populated the primary project with alpha. If I now go and look at the storage account, containers, you will see that there's one called general. Remember, based on my rule, should be able to see that. And then we also have images. Now, if I look at the different images, we have blob index tags on some of them. This one doesn't have it. This one has alpha, which matches Clark Kent. Remember, Clark Kent has a value of alpha. So the second image and the third image, the two that start with do you even, Clark has a matching project. But then the onboard to Azure is Bravo, does not match. SuperCloud, different project completely. So based on our rule, Clark should only be able to access these two images and then something in general. So if we now jump over as Clark, which is where I am right now. Now, important point here. I am using the Entra account for the authentication. I am not using access key. Now, depending on the permissions of the user, maybe they can or can't use the access key. But I'm using the Entra integrated, i.e. the data actions. So now as Clark, if I try and access cloud architect rates, I don't have permission. Onboard to Azure, I don't have permission. Do you even? I have permission. I have permission. If I go up a level to general, I have permission. So you see how powerful those attribute-based access control things are. It completely can transform how I think about those permissions. And it is just so useful for those data scenarios, because it's often the data scenarios where I have that issue where, hey, I do have all these different bits of data and they are related to different projects. Different identities should have different permissions. I don't want to have 50 different containers to do those various permissions. Well, with the attribute-based access control, it transforms how I can think about all of that. Okay. So now Azure Policy. Now I have pretty much on everything we talk about, I have deep dive videos, and I have a deep dive video on Azure Policy and also exceptions and all those things. But this, I think, when I think of governance, this is everything. So Azure Policy sits on top of ARM, and just like role-based access control, anything, if it's portals, CLI, infrastructure as code, there is no way to bypass it. No matter what I do, it has to go through that control plane. It has to go through policy. There is no way to bypass it. And it can be used for both enforcement and audit. For example, sometimes I just want to know, hey, are my resources compliant? Am I meeting this set of requirements I have? Azure Security Center is actually powered by policy. Enforcement is then another step to then restrict what can actually be done. And when I'm using policy, we always start with audit because we can make mistakes. We're human. If I start with enforcement and I suddenly block out the world, that's a huge issue. But if I start with audit, I could see, well, what is the impact this will actually have? How many things are out of compliance? I might need to tweak. I might need to do a better communication plan to my users so they know what's coming, so they don't keep getting hit with this. And if you do get denied, it does give you an explanation. It will say, hey, this is the policy that stopped you. And I can go and look at the policy to understand. So make your descriptions good so people can understand why they're seeing what they're seeing. But you always want to start with audit. And it's really just a set of conditions built around the attributes of the resources that are exposed by something called an alias. So not everything, not every property is exposed, but many of them are, and they're available as these aliases that I can then use as part of my policy. So we had all these properties. And remember, the whole point of this is this governance shield. That's where policy is enforced. So my Azure policy, what color should we use? Use this one. There you go. Policy is enforced here as well. And my policy is created by all of these properties that are available, a whole bunch of them get exposed via an alias. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have if statement. So if these certain conditions based on those aliases are met, so hey, it is a storage account and the type is LRS, then there is some effect. And there's a number of different effects. And the whole point of this is I'm going to assign this at some scope. Now we can see this if we go and look at, it's not a good sign. Just refresh that. If we jump back over a second, let's go to policy. There's a whole bunch of these built in. So if I look at the definitions, I can create custom ones. So I've got all the different policy types, but there are built in, there are custom options here. They're grouped into various different types of categories. So I could just change this to, say, VM. Actually, I'll change it to storage. If I go and look at storage, so I've got all these different conditions of various things that I could go and configure. So storage accounts should restrict network access. So if I select that one, for example, this is the definition. And it can accept various parameters. Notice you've got a description. Parameters are things I can pass in so I can customize it a little bit at the time of assignment. But then we have the rule. So if the type of the resource matches a storage account in the storage resource provider, and network ACL's default action is not deny, because I want it to be deny, then I have some effect. Now, this is passed in, so I can customize as I apply it, but they're recommending audit or deny. So either, hey, I'm going to flag the fact that you didn't do this, or I'm just going to flat out deny you the ability to do it when you try and create this resource. And there's also disabled, which means, hey, this policy isn't actually doing anything at this time. So you have those various capabilities available to you. And there's a huge number of those different effects. Now, the focus is on the resource itself, but there is the ability to actually do a deny action. Today, this can only be, I think it's delete, so I could stop someone deleting something, but it gives you the ability to say, hey, I don't want you to be able to delete this resource, and actually go ahead and configure that via policy. So that is something you can do. I can also group them into initiatives, which makes it far easier to track my compliance and even track enforcement. Because consider, if I end up with hundreds and hundreds of these different policies that I create, these definitions, well, I have to assign it. And that would be really painful to assign hundreds of them. And also when I then look at the compliance, it's just going to be this huge list. And maybe I just care, well, all of these different policies are part of a certain initiative I have to be compliant with this regulation. I'd rather just see how am I doing against the overall set of requirements. So I can take these policies and I can add n number of them into an initiative. And then I can assign the initiative to a certain scope, management group, subscription, resource group. I can assign individual ones as well. It's just, it gets really hard to understand exactly what's happening. if we go back for a second, our starting point in the overview helps us see, well, how are we doing? And I could see here, so these are individual ones applying a tag, and I can see, well, overall, I'm not compliant because how compliant am I? Only 45% of my resources are compliant. Then I have this one over here, which is an initiative. And I can see overall this initiative, almost nothing is compliant. But if I select it, what it would then do is I can see which resources I can dive into the detail, but I can then see the actual policies that make up that initiative. And there's a lot of them. So I can still go and get the detail, but overall, because there are ones from this initiative that aren't compliant, well, overall, I'm not compliant on this. So it's good to be able to know that. So I get the overall view. And if it's green at the top level initiative, fantastic. I'm happy. I've got nothing else to do. If it isn't, I can then dive in and go and actually see that. And these initiatives, so if I look at my definitions for a second and just look at initiatives, these power most of the compliance capabilities that we have. So if you look at things like, hey, I'm curious about FedRAMP High, it's a built-in initiative. NIST, it's a built-in initiative, PCI DSS v4. And it will tell you how many individual policies, 719. Imagine trying to apply 719 separate policy definitions or 720 and then understanding the overall compliance view. It would be hideous. So most of the time when we do anything that is made up of multiple, we're going to create an initiative and then we're going to assign the initiative to some scope. And remember, it gets inherited down. So if it's a very general type initiative that applies to lots of different things, then I will create that and apply that initiative at a higher level management group. And then I get that applied to all of the different things I want. And of course, you can absolutely create your own policy definitions. So if I go and look for a second and just look at custom, you can create your own ones. There are many different effects. So I've got the deny delete, the ones I was just talking about. Well, in this case, if the name, so this is interesting. What my one does here is if it's of a type storage account and I'm taking the field name, and if it matches STG something something prod, then I'm doing a deny action. And the action I'm going to just not let you do is delete. So you cannot delete the storage account. So this is the one place I can kind of do that deny capability. And today it's only delete, is I can do that deny action on this. But I've got ones about no public IP except for a particular subnet. So this is where you can pass it an array of subnets that can have public IPs. I'm checking, is it a network interface? And I'm looking for, our public IP address is false, and it's not in this list of subnets, then I'm going to deny you. And these actions, again, there are many different actions available. But some of the core ones we think about today is we have this capability of just, well, disable, don't evaluate it yet. We have things like append or modify. So append adds an entry to an array field. Modify can add, replace or remove properties or tags. So it's when I need to change the resource as it's being deployed. There's deny. Deny will actually get me a 403 forbidden response. I can't do that thing. Audit is great to track compliance. Then if those conditions are met, I can then also have additional things I want to do to maybe remediate, like there's an audit if not exists. So it tracks some existence condition. There's a deploy if not exists. So deploy if not exists is super powerful because it's going to evaluate a template. And this is really useful to maybe do something after it's been created. So, hey, for some reason, some extension wasn't added, I can do deploy if not exists to use a managed identity that I define and then go and create or add on. So I could add a log analytics extension, for example. I could go and add some agent, add some extension. but it's saying I need to do after the actual deployment and assignment of the resource. There are other things I can do. I can exclude certain things. So when I do an assignment, there might be a child scope. Let's do assign policy for a second. So when I actually assign it to a scope, notice there's this option to do exclusion. Maybe there is a certain resource group or resource that I don't want included. And those would actually be, as part of the policy assignment, be not included. So that's called a not scope. I can have up to 400 of those per assignment. The other thing I could actually do is if I have permission at the scope of assignment. So this is really important. So remember, we assigned this at a certain scope. So let's say I assign it at the subscription level. And on the assignment, I could do not things. I could say not this resource group. But let's say I didn't do that. And now let's say I have this policy and it's tracking compliance and I don't want this resource group included. If I have the permission at the scope of the assignment, it's no good me being a resource group owner. I would have permission at the sub-level. I can do an exemption. An exemption is saying, actually, this is mitigated. It's got a waiver for it. It doesn't change the assignment, but on the resource itself, either resource group or the resource, I'm saying, actually, this marking it as negative on the compliance is not true. It's fine. We've got something else going on. We might use that a lot for some of the built-in, like Defender for Cloud, and it's tracking things. Actually, this is an exempt resource. I could do those various things. So there's capabilities I can do at different scopes to actually remove certain resource groups or other child scopes from being included in an assignment if I need to. I mean, and policy is just so powerful. There's so many times we use policy for so many different things. It's very common to maybe I restrict certain regions. I might restrict certain types of virtual machine SKUs. So maybe in development, hey, don't let me use the big expensive ones. I can only do that in production. Maybe in production, I don't want to use locally redundant storage accounts. I have to use ZRS or GRS or GZRS. Maybe I have to have certain tags present. Maybe I want to restrict certain public IP addresses in certain places. You get the idea, but this is where you can go and enforce the various requirements you actually have. So it's take some time, understand this, get those guardrails before I ever create a resource, which is why we're doing governance so early in this course. So then we get into cost management and budgets. Cost management gives me insight and control of Azure and actually AWS as well. There's a connector for AWS. If you are using the other one, you can get insight into the cost there and track actually what I'm using the spend on. So I get cost analysis. So this gives me insight into how I'm spending my money. There are also smart views that give me insights, and they're really useful because they're using machine learning to spot some deviation in how we're spending money. So if we jump over, now I don't have anything particularly interesting in my environment because I don't spend a lot of money. But if I go to cost management, and then I can go to cost analysis. If I go to all views, you'll see the various ones available. Now, you can see here we have these smart views. Now, this is Azure OpenAI, resource groups, resources, and services. And then you have customizable views, cost by resource, cost by service, etc. So the smart views, if I just go and select one of these, again, it's running machine learning over these, and I get insights. So, hey, I had a daily run rate of up 72% on a certain day. And I can go and drill in and see all of the various insights it has available. But it has a nice view available for me here. I can customize it. I can download information. There's various configurations I can perform. But it's nice sets of data. And I can actually go and see the specific resources, and I can expand them out if there's sort of different components to their bill. I get fantastic sets of insight into how I'm spending this. And then I also, exit that wrong thing. If we just look at those customizable ones, if I was to go and look at, let's say, daily costs, notice I have this option to add filters. So I could add a filter based on many things, including tag. So, hey, only show me this tag as this certain value, etc. So I can really just get the exact view I want. I can group it based on different things. So I'm grouping by resource group name, but I could change how I'm doing the grouping. I really wish they'd stop asking for how I rate this experience. It's going to be a really bad review. But you just get this fantastic level of information available here. And this is also available through all the billing APIs. Now, if I was having Azure reservations, for example, there'd also be an monetized view. So that gives me the reservation use spread over the purchase time. So those are going to be available in the reservations view. I don't have any in my environment, but you would have those. Another nice thing you can do here is I can set up automatic export. So you'll notice there's this export option right here. So I can do export and configure, hey, I want to create a certain set of data to be exported on this frequency, which I could then go and grab from something else. So that's a really great capability. I can also have cost anomaly alerts. So I can look at an alert rule, and I can do add. So this is, again, using those machine learning. And hey, if I get these cost anomalies, I can create this alert so it emails these certain people to let me know, hey, there's something is going on. So this is about understanding the costs I have, not always after I've spent it. So we have the cost analysis, we have the cost anomaly alerts. Then we have budgets. So budgets let me actually say, well, look, this is the amount I want to spend. And I can, again, have it at different scopes, management groups up, resource groups. I can have a filter like, hey, it's only if this is this certain tag, it's this certain resource type. I can get very, very specific. And then I can say, what do I want to happen when I hit certain thresholds of that budget? So that could be a notification. It could be calling a webhook. It could be calling an Azure function. And it's not just based on how much I've spent, I can actually create budgets based on the forecasted spend as well. And that's where it gets really powerful. So if I jump over to here and we go and look at our budgets. So right now my scope is at the subscription level. So this is a budget for the entire subscription. And I can actually just look at this subscription. And if I edit, well, you can see what I did here is, notice that I don't have any filters, but I could add filters. I could absolutely say, well, it's only for this resource type. It's only for tags that matches a certain value. So there's a lot of granularity I can add to the budget. I'm not doing that. $125 is the budget. And notice straight away it's showing me my historical kind of spend, how I've been tracking against that. And then it shows, hey, here's the budget line. And what I can then do is create actions. And notice my action can be based on the actual amount I spent or the forecasted amount I'm going to spend based on my current trend. So rather than waiting till I hit 100%, if it's trending that it's going to hit 100%, or in my case, hey, look, if it's trending that I'm going to hit 120%, I want you to perform this action. Or if my actual is at 80%, then perform this action. And it's really flexible. So yes, there's the idea of a recipient to send an email, but what's powerful here is his ability to call an action group. And we'll talk more about action groups later on in this course. But the whole point of an action group is I can send an SMS message. I can call a webhook. I can call a secure webhook. I can call a function, a logic app. I can hook into an ITSM system and create a ticket. So there's huge amounts of things I can do there. I did mention earlier that tags don't get inherited except for billing. So actually, it would be good to show you that. Now, I need to do it for a non-MSDN sub. So if I go to my cost management for a second, we just go to my subscriptions and make my lab subscription. And if I go to my cost analysis, we have this option to configure subscription. If I select this, we have tag inheritance. I have disabled. This is what you would do is if for the billing, I want it for the resources to use this particular tag from the parent resource group or subscription, I would set this to enabled. Because maybe I don't have control, I don't have good policies, or maybe it's a more granular level at the per resource, but I actually care about the billing at the resource group or the subscription level. Well, that's what I would do. I could go ahead and turn that on, set the tag inheritance. Again, it's not actually writing the tag to the resource, but from a billing perspective, it will inherit that tag when it does those sort of billing rollups. So I can trigger actions. There's also the idea of cost allocation. So cost allocation is an interesting one. Imagine the scenario that you have some kind of shared resource, and you probably do. Like if I think of my environment, all right, so cost allocation. You might have all the different business units that have their apps and their resources in their subscriptions. Fantastic. But you may have some source, which might be things in a certain subscription, things in a certain resource group. Maybe they're even tagged with a certain value. And these are actually really shared. Maybe it's an express route circuit. Maybe it's some shared set of infrastructure that has domain controllers. And I, as an organization, don't think it's fair that I just pay for that. What I have is a whole bunch of targets. And those targets could also be subscriptions, resource groups, or tag things. And they're actually the ones that benefit from these shared things. They're consuming my express route circuit. They're using these shared services. So what I want to do is I want to split the resources that I'm defining as the source, everything in this sub or in these resource groups with this tag, and I want to split it among those targets. Now that split could just be even. It could be based on some custom percentage that I say, or what's really nice is I can do a proportional. And what the proportional does is it's based on the spend of the targets I list, so these subscriptions, these resource groups. So I could do overall. So if this subscription spends $10,000 and this subscription spends $1,000, well, 10 times of the amount that I'm splitting would go to the one that spends more money, because proportionally, they're probably using more of the source. Or I could be more granular. It's just based on the amount they spend of the compute resource provider, of the storage resource provider, or the network resource provider. Because you can imagine if it's an express route circuit, then maybe their overall spend is not the right metric, but the amount they spend on network resources, well, maybe that would be more applicable. So it gives me a way to take these costs and then split them among those other people. And what the other people would see if I'm this target is when I look at my bill would show the stuff that I got as part of my accumulated cost. And I would also see this idea of allocated cost. So I would understand where it came from. I'd be like, oh, they're giving me this stuff because, yep, they're using it as part of this other service. So if I do have shared services in my environment, then that ability to do cost allocation is really nice, because it doesn't mean I just absorb it as a company and I can never explain, well, why or who's using it. I just go and divide it up among all the business users because they're the ones it's there for. And then I choose how I want to do that split. There is an API available. So there's an Azure reporting API via the Microsoft Billing Resource Provider. So I can go and review the costs, and I can use that at a subscription level or enterprise agreement level. There's also a Microsoft Cost Management connector available in Power BI Desktop. Now, when you talk about Microsoft Cost Management, it is Microsoft Cost Management. It's not just Azure. So yes, it's Azure, but it would also have M365, Dynamics 365 Power Platform costs available in there as well. And make sure you don't just create stuff and kind of hope for the best that the costs are okay. There's a pricing calculator. What happened there? There's a pricing calculator. So I can estimate what my costs would be. I could go in, I don't know what I've got. So I've got VM selected. I could say, well, how many hours is it going to be running? What type of virtual machine it's going to be? How many of them am I going to have? And I could work out the cost. I can do that for the storage, for the database, for AI services, for all these different things. So just take some time and try and plan out what I think my costs might actually be. Because you don't just want to get hit with a bill and then be sad. And always optimize your Azure costs. Now, I've got whole sets of other material about this. But think about how a resource can be used. What are the dimensions of the cost that could apply to it? Like, if I have a service that lets users upload stuff, well, how do I know they don't go nuts? I'm going to pay for that. So make sure you think of not just how I'm architecting my solution, think of all of the ways things interact with your solution and what are the dimensions of cost that could actually hit it. Now, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about optimizations I can do on VM scale sets and anything like that. I mean, there are some obvious things like, hey, make sure you right size, pick the right type of service, the right shapes. And we'll talk about that more when I talk about virtual machines. Use auto scale, so you change the number of instances you have based on the work coming in. Use serverless where you can. So I only actually do work when some event happens to trigger that work. Shut things down when I'm not using them. If it's test dev, can I just delete it all and then use infrastructure as code to just recreate it when I need to do another test? Take advantage of all the free stuff. But no matter what you do, you're going to have to spend some money. And so there are particular mechanisms to help you spend less money or get discounts. So the first one is Azure Reservations. So Azure Reservations provide a discount. The exact discount varies based on the type of resource. Is it a 1 or a 3-year term? For a very specific resource, if it's a VM of a very specific family, in a very specific region. So I've used the word specific many, many times because it's a very, very specific operation. If I think of all of the different possible targets I might have as part of this. So in my world, sure, maybe I have, there's a DV, maybe I'm using a certain amount of DV5s. Maybe I'm using a certain amount of EV5s. And maybe from a region perspective, I'm using West US 3 and I'm using East US 2. I could say, hey, for DV5s in West US 3, I'm going to create an Azure reservation of a certain amount of dollars for 1 year. For EV5s, I'm going to create a different Azure reservation for a different amount of spend for 3 years. I have to also create one for East US 2. So I end up creating all these different specific reservations that are super specific. Maybe I also go and create one for storage. And that would be Azure Reservation 4 for that particular region for a certain amount of dollars for a certain duration. So they're super specific. It's a billing function. The billing engine wakes up every hour, applies the discount on the applicable resources. Now remember, if I'm using it or not, I pay for it. I've committed to running this amount of this resource in this region for 1 or 3 years. So if there's a particular hour I don't maximize that type of resource, I still pay for it. I'm blocking that hotel room all the time. Now, reserved instances I can trade them in. So I have a certain amount of remaining time. Maybe I've changed my requirement. Microsoft were going to do away with that. They were going to get rid of that trade-in ability beginning of 2024. But at the time of recording, they extended it indefinitely, so you still can. And it gives you, therefore, a very big discount, but it's very specific. Now, I can create this at a scope like an enterprise agreement or a management group or subscription, so all of the child resources can count towards consuming, hey, I've basically got 80 CPU hours per hour of DV5 in WestUS 3, but if I only used 50, I still pay for 80. So it's very specific. I need to really understand my requirements, but I get a really nice discount. And then the other options we have is an Azure Compute Savings Plan. And this is super flexible. So if the word I kept using for the other thing was very specific, the word I'm going to use for this one is very flexible. So when I think about the savings plan, it's all about compute services. So it's all about compute. And it includes VMs. So yes, those, but all of the other types of things I could have there. And I can apply it to the same scopes, like an enterprise agreement, a management group, a subscription. But it covers VMs, it covers dedicated host, includes Azure Container Instances, Azure Container Apps. It includes Azure Spring Apps Enterprise, but that's being deprecated soon, so I'm not even going to bother writing that. It covers the Functions Premium Plan. It covers specific app service. I think it's the app service Premium v3 and the upgraded isolated v2. Bare metal VMs are not included. The AV1 is not included. But it's all of these compute things for any region. I don't have to be any more specific. I create an Azure savings plan for a certain duration, 1 or 3 years, and I say I'm going to spend this much. If I consume it 1 hour on ACA and these VMs the next hour on, it doesn't matter. It's a discount for any compute that's included in any region, and it's a billing mechanism. Now, the exact discount generally is not as good as the Azure reservation. Because remember, the Azure reservation is super, super specific. So it gives you a really good discount. Like if I look at, what is this? This is a DV2. Let's change this SKU to a D2V5. There we go. So look at a newer virtual machine. Now it's showing me the discounts. So for an Azure reservation, 1 year is a 58% discount, 3 years is a 63%. So it's a fantastic discount, but remember, it's super specific. Savings plan, 31% discount for 1 year, 54% for 3 years. So it's still good. It's not as good, but that's what you would expect because it's so much more flexible. If I looked at an entirely different type of resource, so let's look at container instances. So we look at Azure Container Instances. Well, Azure Containers isn't even available for Azure reservations, but as part of savings plan, it's a 27% for 1 year and 52% for 3 years. So we can see that's those discounts based on if it was existing in this particular region. But again, it applies everywhere. So it's just fantastic flexibility I get with the savings plan. If you had an Azure reservation and you had a savings plan, it would apply the reservation first because it's the bigger discount. And then if I still had other resources left over, then it would go and start applying the savings plan. Azure Hybrid benefit is about the license of the OS or SQL, and there's some other things around Linux. And it basically lets me bring my existing licenses I may own to use them against the Azure resources. So the idea here is, hey, look, I already have a bunch of this license. I don't want to pay for it again. I want to use the ones I have. And we see this already, actually. So if we looked at the VM again, my VM charge is actually got two components. There's the compute element. And in this case, because it's Windows, there's an OS license. And it even shows me the amount I'm paying for the license. It would show me this for my SQL and other things as well. If I say I have Azure Hybrid Benefit, well, it doesn't bill me for the license. I just pay for the raw compute charge. So make sure you take advantage of as many of these things as you can, because, hey, I don't like wasting money. Really important thing to understand. None of these are actually really improving the guarantee the capacity will be available when I try to create the resource. The name Azure Reservation conjures up this fantastic idea that I'm reserving, because it has reservation in the name, that capacity in that region for that SKU. You are not at all. You are committing to spend that amount of money in that region of that SKU for a nice, healthy discount. But if there was some run-on-the-bank, rainy day scenario that everyone was suddenly creating that resource and yours weren't running, and then you try to start it or create it, and you get a capacity failure, that can happen. You have not reserved the actual capacity, despite the name. Now, the general best practice is to try and be as regionally flexible and SKU flexible as you can. You then have the highest chance of being able to create your resource, even in rainy day scenarios. If I need a hotel room, if I don't care which hotel and I'm flexible in what street I can get a hotel room, I can probably get a hotel room. If I must have a hotel room in this hotel that must have these features and must be on this floor, there's a greater chance it wouldn't be available. So the more flexible you can be, the better. But if I absolutely must, always with an SLA-backed guarantee, be able to provision a particular type of resource in a very specific region or AZ, that's what an on-demand capacity reservation for. That is where I am actually reserving and having an SLA-backed guarantee that I will be able to create my resource in that region, in that AZ of this very specific SKU. And the way it works is as soon as I create the on-demand capacity reservation, I start paying for it. And then I create resources into the capacity reservation. So I then go and create the VMs into it. I can delete it at any time, but hey, if I try and create it again and there isn't capacity, I won't be able to create the capacity reservation. So it's my way of blocking that capacity when I absolutely must have it, but you're paying for it. It works really nicely with Azure Reservations because obviously Azure Reservations, I'm paying for it at a very specific scope as well. It must be this region and this particular type. So if I have an Azure reservation, there's generally not a lot of harm in putting the capacity reservation on top of it to actually lock in the capacity as well. But it's a really important point to understand because people get confused and they get it wrong. They think they're locking in the capacity with an Azure reservation. You are not. They're very different things. So always take some time to understand the specifics around that. I want to quickly talk about deployment stacks. Now, this is maybe more infrastructure as code, but I want to briefly mention it. So we used to have something called blueprints, and we still do, but they're being deprecated. Blueprints were combinations of creating resource groups, applying role-based access control, creating resources via ARM templates, assigning policies. I can do all of that with templates anyway. I don't need a blueprint for that. They did add the ability to protect the resources, though. So they had a read-only or do not delete via specific deny assignments, and I could only do those in blueprints. I even created a video on blueprints without using blueprints. Deployment stacks replace all that. Now, a deployment stack is just a collection of resources that I want to perform lifecycle operations in common. Now, that sounds a lot like a resource group. The idea here is we are going to use them as lifecycle boundaries. And sometimes we're faced with a scenario where they can't all be contained in a resource group. Maybe they have to be sprinkled over multiple resource groups, maybe over multiple subscriptions, but they actually still are a complete unit. I want to create them together. I might want to delete them all together at a certain time. So we use them as another type of lifecycle boundary. So everything in the stack will get created together. When I delete the stack, I actually have the option of either deleting all those things as well. So it's a really nice cleanup capability. Or I could set an action on unmanaged to simply make them unmanaged, and then they'll be left alone, but now they're just regular resources. And I can add and remove things from the deployment stack at any time. Whatever the scope where I deploy the resource stack, all of the resources must be a child of whatever that target is. So if I deploy the deployment stack to a resource group, for example, then all of the resources would have to be in that resource group. If I deployed the deployment stack at a subscription, well, the resources could be spread over lots of different resource groups. If I deploy it at a management group, they could be in any resource group in any subscription that is a child of that. And the nice thing about deployment stacks is it's just a regular template. The only thing that changes is how I deploy it. So it's just my same bicep file that I would ordinarily be using. And then when I do the deployment of the stack, instead of using like AZ deployment, I use AZ stack. So if I look at VS Code for a second, I think I have a file available here. So this is how I would normally deploy. I would do an AZ deployment group. I do an AZ stack group. That's it. Now, what happens now, though, is the name of the deployment stack is way more important, because normally the name of a deployment you don't care about because it's really a one-time thing. Who cares? With a deployment stack, this is the name of the deployment stack, so I care a lot more about this. Then I just specify the name of the stack, but then we do have these idea of deny settings that I can add on top of it. So that's what's really good here, is I have this deniability that we had with the blueprints before. So I can actually say, well, hey, look, I don't want you to be able to modify these resources, or I don't want you to be able to delete the resources. I have that ability to lock those things down. But it's really a lot richer than what we could do with blueprints. Blueprints, I could just deny, delete, or make it read only. With blueprints, I can exclude certain principles. So maybe a break glass account could do actions. I can also exclude certain types of actions on them as well. So it's just a really nice capability. I can also control how deny things cascade to child resources. So it's a really rich functionality. And in general, there's no reason not to use deployment stacks. Like if I'm doing a deployment, instead of doing the regular deploy command, do the deployment stack command. There's not a downside with doing it. Azure Resource Graph and resource configuration changes. It lets me query the control plane, so all of the information that control plane knows about, in a really, really efficient way, using the Kusto query language we use for log analytics. Regular ARM, as we kind of saw a little bit earlier, there's limits on how many ARM interactions I can do. I think it's 12,000 reads per hour. And you can actually clog those up. The Azure Resource Graph is super fast. It works at massive scale. I can still only see the objects I have access to, and it's only queries. I cannot make any changes as part of it. But it's the same KQL that we do use in log analytics. And I can also use it through the portal. I can use it through PowerShell. So it's a very flexible thing. And it's just a great way to go and see information. So if we jump over super quickly. So if I was to look at resource graph query, for example, I can just run a command, summarize count of basically resources by subscription, and then format it as a table. So I'm just running my KQL command, and I got the result. So based on my 2 subscriptions, I got 513 resources in this subscription. Now, there are still limits on how many of these queries I can do. If I run it with debug, If I scroll up and I can find it. Right. So what you can see here, quota remaining and when the quota resets. So I get 15 requests every 5 seconds. So I used one, so I had 14 left, and it's telling me it's going to reset in 4 seconds. So I can do 15 of these every 5 seconds. So it's not infinite, but given how rich and powerful these are, you're unlikely to really hit a bottleneck with the way that works. And also, I can just go into the resource graph explorer, and I could just go and run queries from here. I mean, there's great examples, list all public IP addresses. It's giving me the KQL it's using. I can just run the query, and it's always going to be super fast because of how it operates. It's not doing one request and getting detail from ARM. It's using this separately maintained, really high-performant database to actually get this information. So I can interface from the portal. I can interface through the CLI. All these different ways I can actually go and get the information to see all of the things I care about. And it's massively powerful. There's really almost nothing you can't do as part of that resource graph. Now, it's not very good at understanding permissions on particular things, but outside of that, if I just want to know configurations and how I have things done, I would always use the resource graph. Now, the other thing we have is there's a resource configuration changes capability that's powered by the resource graph, but this is now tracking, well, what is being modified in my environment based on changes to the properties of it. So it's a change analysis solution. And I'm going to show you the preview experience at time of recording. It gives me better filtering. It's tenant-wide querying. I can see the change actor. So the change actor is, well, who changed it, which client was used, like the portal, and the actual operation being called. So here, now if we go and look at change analysis preview, it will show me all the changes to my environment. I don't know if I've got anything particularly interesting as part of mine. There was a storage account change. So I could scroll over. See, the Azure portal was the client. I changed it. I can see when it was changed. I can dive in. I can see it was a tags issue. I could actually select the changes, and it will show me the before and the after. And specifically in this case, I can see I created a new tag. I can see there was a creation time change. There's some few things got updated, but it's a really great way. So if something goes wrong, and at a certain time something just breaks, it's like, well, I don't know what happened. Go and look at the change feed, and I can probably get a good idea of work out, well, what changed, and go and see this. It's enabled by default on the ARM control plane. I can also enable it on things like app service plans. At time of recording, I can look back 14 days. If I wanted to be able to look back further, I'd probably write a function or a logic app to take it and go and put it into a log analytics workspace or something. But it's really fantastic for that observability. Before we go, just quickly, when we think about things to help us, Azure Advisor is huge. Throughout Azure lifetime, things are changing, my needs change, capabilities change, new SKUs are created. And I need to be constantly thinking about, is there new optimizations? Should I be reevaluating how I do this? So Azure Advisor provides recommendations around key areas. And I recommend kind of going looking weekly. And I can also create alerts based on those new recommendations. And it's broken down into different key areas. So if I go and look at my Azure Advisor, I actually get an advisor score. So the advisor score is really nice. It shows me, well, based on the core things, I'm at 88%. I can see by various categories how I'm doing for my optimizations. I can see the breakdown of different recommendations I have based on cost and security and reliability, and operational excellence, performance. So it gives me things to focus on to help my environment. Hey, your VM is pretty idle. hey, you should probably start using autoscale. Hey, you could probably use a different SKU of this disk, etc. I can set up these alerts. So I could create an alert to tell me, hey, if I have a certain category, maybe security, and it's of a certain impact level, I want you to call this action group. Remember, action group could go and email me. It could go and create an ITSM ticket that I should go and act on. So there's a whole set of different capabilities that I can do about that. It would have recommendations on buying Azure reservations, app service plan optimizations. There's a whole set of different things that I might use here. There's the ability to create summarization digests. So, hey, based on the recommendations, summarize it on this frequency and email it to me. So it's really designed to help us be successful. So you can see here, hey, look, create a recommendation digest that would then notify me of a summary of all these things on a certain interval. I can create assessments that ask me some questions, and when they would drive me through with, again, actionable steps that I might want to take. So Advisor is fantastic. Go and spend some time on Advisor. It will 100% help you out. Finally, I'm not going to go through these, but things to go and look at. So the governance docs are really good. They give you things to think about, how to plan out. The landing zones are about getting everything ready for easy adoption prep work for around your environment, for identity, governance, HR, DR, security, monitoring, networking. It's really good ways to help stamp out a best practices solution. The cloud adoption framework and the well-architected framework, how I think about Azure and then how I think about individual workloads and their configurations. There's a review as part of the well-architected framework. The Azure Architecture Center for examples around all the different architecture things, but just great resources. I have videos on all of these to help the understanding if you want to dive into that. But end of our module. So I hope our governance module helped, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video.